Our next tropical storm update at 12:15. Bulletins at once. I'm Charlie Davis.
Bob Lassiter, News Radio 970 WFLA.
10.5 minutes after the hour of 12 noon. November 22nd, 1988. November 22nd, 1963. There are all kinds of significant years in a person's life. Significant for all different kinds of reasons, I suppose. 1963 is a significant year for virtually everyone who was alive at that time and is still alive today. For some of us, 1963 was even a more significant year than the obvious. People have been talking for the last several hours on this radio station, and people are talking all across the country. On radio stations and in bars and in restaurants and living rooms and front porches and backyards about where were you November 22nd, 1963. I had just turned 18 years old just a few weeks before on September the 30th. So 1963 was a significant year for me because that was the year that I turned 18. Now, back then, there were really two legal ages. There was 18 and 21. At 18, you no longer had to go to school, and you were responsible for some things, but, of course, you couldn't vote, and you couldn't own property or enter into contracts and things of that nature, at least in the state I grew up in, until you were 21 years of age. So it was kind of a limbo in between childhood and adulthood. I had left school when I was 16 in 1961. And like most high school dropouts, I'd spent 2 years pretty much just wandering around doing absolutely nothing with my life, with an occasional meaningless job, meaningless and menial. And then there was 1963. Wow, what a year it was. It was an incredible year, a year that, even without a Kennedy assassination, I would have never forgotten. It was the year that I bought my first automobile, a 1960 Plymouth Valiant, kind of a sick pea green. It was a 3-speed on the column, and the previous owner had put in one of those conversion kits. Bought it for damn near nothing. $500 because the car was really beat. I mean, really beat, even though it was only 3 years old. But I remember that car. It's a marvel I didn't wash the paint off of it, because it got washed almost every day for months and months and months. 1963, that was the year that I stole a cool guy's girl. Yeah, there was one of these cool guys in Collingswood, and he had a girl, and I stole her. That's right. She started going out with me, stopped going out with him. That was really neat. Whoa. He eventually stole her back, but that's beside the point. I remember that summer. Fantastic. That summer I lost my virginity. That's something to remember. No, not with a cool guy's girl, but with someone who I never even knew her name, and an apartment that I didn't really know who it belonged to in New York City. It was all very strange. 1963 was the year I was propositioned for the first time. Unfortunately, it was by a member of the same sex. 1963 was the year that I hitchhiked back and forth across the country, not once but twice. 1963 was the year I spent my first night on a park bench. Spent my first night on a beach. It was the year I first saw the Pacific Ocean. 1963 was the year I got my own place. I didn't want to get my own place. I had to get my own place. Turns out that it was a shabby little room next to the bathroom. Fortunately, I didn't have to walk. Residential hotel in downtown Camden, New Jersey. What made it extraordinary is that it was directly across the street from the Cooper Hospital. Cooper Hospital is where I was born. The delivery room literally overlooked this building that I ended up living in 1963 at the age of 18. I mentioned that room because a lot of things were going to happen in that room. It was in that room that I first read in a column written by Earl Wilson about some weird English musical group called the Beatles. was in that room that I would spend November 24th, 25th, 1963, glued to a little black and white television set.
We're expecting high tides 2 to 4 feet above normal.
On News Radio 970 WFLA.
19 and a half minutes after the hour of 12 noon. November 22nd, 1963 was just an ordinary day. At least it started out as just an ordinary day. Because of the events later in that day, there are some things I would remember about it that I might not otherwise. For example, in Camden, New Jersey, it was a relatively warm day for the latter part of November. Temperatures probably in the upper 50s or low 60s. The sun was shining. No doubt I woke up somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 o'clock. It would have been my usual waking up time. No doubt I watched the last hour of the Today Show. I used to love doing that. No, it had been an extraordinary year for me. A year of sex and drugs and rock and roll. Almost a young man's dream come true. I had seen people and places and things that nice boys from Collingswood, New Jersey were not meant to see. Only a few months earlier, I was in New York City and I saw people tying off their arms with little rubber hoses and putting makeshift needles into veins and throwing up and doing it all over again in an hour or two. I witnessed a gang rape. I begged for food and money out on the streets, slept on park benches, was propositioned by gay guys, lost my virginity, smoked my first joint, did my first serious heavy drugs. That summer I'd talked to trees. I'd also communicated with nature out on the west coast of this great country. I had been through the Rocky Mountains. I had been through some of the great cities. It was an extraordinary year. Just a few months earlier. It was a very, very different America than the America that exists today. Things like segregation were still a fact of life for millions of Americans. Millions of Americans could not even vote, literally, or attend the school of their choosing, or even sit down at a lunch counter. There was growing concern about some place called Vietnam, but only among a handful of people. Most people just ignored it. There were new words and phrases and names cropping up all the time. Things like civil rights and Timothy Leary and tune in and turn on and drop out and something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and a man named Martin Luther King Jr. They were in the news more and more and more back in those days. The king of rock and roll was home from Europe out of uniform. He was back home from the army. But guys like Simon and Garfunkel and Bob Dylan and even a group called Peter, Paul, and Mary seemed to be getting far, far more attention on the radio than the king of rock and roll. My goodness, he was starting to push 30. He was an old dude. The 1964 model cars were in the showrooms. It was the kind of America where people paid attention to such things. It looked like it was going to be a very promising year for Detroit. I had my eye on an Oldsmobile Starfire convertible, had a list price of about $5,500. It was almost the top of the line, if indeed it wasn't the top of the line. Other people were looking at cars like Corvairs and Mustangs, other such things. And I was working at Albert's. Albert's was a small restaurant in a little suburban community called Haddon Heights, New Jersey. Haddon Heights was, 7 or 8 miles from Camden, which was right next door to Philadelphia. It was very similar to the town that I grew up in, Collingswood, very similar to all the towns around there. Haddonfield, Westmont, Oak Lynn, Audubon, they all pretty much looked the same. If you were to go through them, you couldn't tell the difference between them. Natives can, of course. And Albert's was on the main street of Haddon Heights. And it was a little place that opened for breakfast and served lunch and even had an early dinner. Nobody went out of their way to go to Albert's. It was just a little town, little local restaurant. I used to take the number 21 public service bus from Camden to get there, if memory serves me correct. my memory does serve me correct in terms of what I did there, I was the dishwasher. Got $1.35 an hour, I think. Surely not much more if it was any more. I had no idea of what I was going to do with my life. I was a reasonably typical 18-year-old. I mean, not only were there all the events of the first 18 years of my life to sort out, there were all the events of the first 325 days of the year 1963 to try to sort through. And that was such a mind-boggling job that a gig in the kitchen of Albert's was about all I could possibly handle. Now, Albert was a very reasonable man. As I recall, he was probably in his latter 30s, early 40s, half bald, thin, very energetic guy. Albert had, so the story goes, worked for a corporation someplace, had a usual corporate-type job, shuffling papers around, and he couldn't take it anymore, so he quit and he opened up his own little restaurant right there in Haddon Heights, New Jersey. And it was a reasonably successful little restaurant. The food wasn't great, but it was cheap, and it was edible, and the kitchen was clean, and the waitresses were friendly, and everybody that came into Albert seemed to know each other. He did the cooking on one side of the double doors that led into the kitchen from the outer restaurant. I washed away on the other side of the double doors. Now, Albert liked to talk while he worked. Albert liked to discuss the issues. It was an all but impossible task until I arrived, since very few people that worked at Albert's in the kitchen could discuss the issues with him. They didn't read the newspaper. They didn't watch the evening news. They didn't subscribe to Time magazine. I did. They didn't have much to say about the civil rights movement or that problem over in Asia or the ramifications of talking the steel companies into rolling back their prices. But I did. And Albert would stand over at his workstation cooking away all day, and I would stand over at my workstation washing the dishes and talking the day away. Made it go much, much more quickly and much more pleasantly. It was somewhere around 1:30, as I recall. I couldn't tell you the exact time if you put a gun to my head. Albert was just about finished up with a luncheon rush, and I was still up to my ears in dirty dishes from that rush. And we were jabbering back and forth about something or other. There was this little wooden shelf up to the left of the big stainless steel workstation that served as my area of employment. And on that shelf was a radio, kind of one of those cheap Art Deco kind of radios that you would have had back in the late 1940s. With some plastic fake chrome and made out of, as I seem to recall it, a burgundy-colored dark plastic. That radio was always tuned to radio station WIP. Now, WIP was the kind of radio station in Philadelphia that your parents would have listened to. But in 1963, a hip young dude did not want to listen to WIP. But then Albert wasn't a hip young dude. Albert was a parent, and it was his restaurant, and it was his radio. And usually the radio was on just barely enough to realize it was on, not really quite loud enough to listen to. Not quite loud enough to listen to. And somebody came running into the kitchen and said, "Oh my God, the president's been shot. Turn up the radio." And I was the one who was working closest to the radio. And I reached up and I turned up the volume just in time to hear the announcer say that they were going to switch to Dallas, where a terrible, terrible thing had happened. The President of the United States had just been shot.
We're keeping up with Tropical Storm Keith for you. This concludes this test of the emergency broadcast system.
12:33 and a half the time. When I initially sat down to make some notes to talk about that day, my first impression was that at the moment that we turned up the radio, everything came to a halt. And thinking about it, that's not really what happened. Actually, everything went into slow motion. Albert kind of stopped cooking. I slowly cleaned up the dishes as we listened to the radio, waited for word from someplace called Parkland Hospital in Dallas. as to how the president was. Suddenly those waitresses and other kitchen help who never really seemed to have anything to say about anything that was going on in the world outside of their own little sphere were passing comments. Everybody hoped that the president would make it. Some people were talking about how much they admired him. Other people were talking about how much they disagreed with him. But that had nothing to do with the man being shot. That wasn't right. And then it suddenly started to dawn on us. These kinds of things did not happen in America. Damn it, this kind of stuff did not happen. This was the kind of stuff that happened in South America and in Southeast Asia and sometimes even in Europe. But this kind of stuff didn't happen in America. There must be something awfully, awfully wrong. And at about that time, people started to wonder, my God, is this the beginning of a war? Sometimes wars start with the assassination of a leader. And so we listened all the closer to the radio. And then something in the neighborhood of a half hour or so later, there was the report, the initial report that, indeed, President John F. Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was dead. Then the world did come to a halt. Albert's was a classic Haddon Heights type of building. It was double-wide store. The exterior was colonial, if you will, early American. When you walked into Albert's, on the left-hand side was a luncheon counter with those little stools that spin around. And in the center of the store and then off to the right-hand side were tables and booths. And basically the people up and down the street would come into Albert's for a quick lunch, and they would sit at the counter. And the men and women who were shopping or taking care of business who had stopped in for lunch would sit at the booths and the tables. Albert's did a hell of a lunch. The lunch actually lasted till about 2 o'clock on most days. Well, suddenly the orders stopped coming in, but the people were still there. But slowly, one by one, they got up and left. We moved the radio out into the front of the restaurant, and the kitchen help, dishwasher included, were permitted to come out and sit at those stools and listen to the radio with the customers. There were probably about half a dozen of us who actually worked at Albert's, and probably another half a dozen customers who just could not leave, who just sat there. Occasionally there would be a sentence uttered, but primarily it was silence. Waiting for the air raid sirens to go off, waiting for somebody to come on and say, gotcha, practical joke, waiting for we didn't know what. Just sitting there. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3:30, as I recall, Albert said, well, it's not right. We should all go home. We're not going to do any business anyway, and I don't want to do any business. Not today. And so we started to close the place up, and the customers left, and it was just Albert and the crew doing the final touches. And as we started for the door, Albert said, I don't think I'm going to be open tomorrow. I'll pay you, but don't come in. We're not going to open. It's not right. And we said, okay, and started for the door again. And Albert said, wait a second. I don't think it's right to be open until after the funeral. So don't come back to work until after the funeral. The day after the funeral, we'll open again, if everything's okay. It was a strange day. A day that started out just like any other kind of day. Maybe even better than most, since it was really beautiful weather for that time of the year. Nobody knew when they went off for work that day that life would never again be quite the same. Never, ever again. Some people say we lost our innocence that day. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. I don't know. Who really knows for sure? Strangely enough, many of the problems that we talk about today existed then. Maybe not on quite as large a scale, but they existed. I remember getting on the bus, the old Oh, the car? The car was gone by then. Fell apart. So I remember getting on the old number 21 public service bus and going back into Camden, back to my rented room, directly across the street from the hospital I was born in. It cost me $10 a week, and I had a very difficult time paying the rent on it. I remember buying the newspapers. I always bought the newspapers. And there were extra editions and bulletin editions and special editions. Going up into the room and turning on the tiny little black and white TV set, just stacking the newspapers and sitting there watching whatever was going on. It was almost a miracle. It was indeed television's finest hour, using all kinds of tricks and stunts and gadgets that I had never seen used before, but putting us live in touch with what was actually going on. There was film footage and sometimes even videotape footage of some of the events that I had missed that day. Like Lyndon Johnson standing there with his hand on a Bible next to Mrs. Kennedy, being sworn in on an airplane in Texas. And cuts back and forth in interviews with all kinds of people, and on and on and on it seemed to go. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and went out and got drunk. I wasn't old enough to drink, but I knew this little bar in a working-class neighborhood where they didn't ask questions, and especially on days like that. And I went down there and I sat there and I drank my drink of the day, which was screwdrivers. I probably had a ham sandwich. I usually did when I went to that bar. But I don't really remember getting that drunk, though I tried. Somewhere in the neighborhood of midnight, I walked back up to the main street to catch another bus to go back down to the room. There was one man standing on the corner, a young black man, perhaps in his mid-20s. We just kind of looked at each other. Seemed as though the bus was never going to come. And finally we started talking to each other, basically asking each other, why? Why did this happen? How did this happen? Did it really happen? Are we really? Is this a bad dream? And finally the bus came and we got on together, and we were probably the only people on the bus. I can't really remember any others. And he got off before I did, and I finally got off and went back to my little room. The astonishing thing is, hard as I try, I can remember utterly, absolutely, positively nothing of November 23rd, 1963. The next thing I can remember, is laying across the bed again on a bright sunny morning, not quite as warm as it had been November 22nd, several degrees cooler. Watching television. The preliminary ceremonies for the funeral. And then a cutaway to Dallas, because they were going to be moving that awful man, that terrible, awful man who shot the president and caused all of this grief and aggravation. What a strange couple of days. Almost immediately, there was all kinds of crazy talk about conspiracies and plots and cloak and dagger kinds of stuff, and they were blaming everybody from Khrushchev to Castro to even people in our own government. There was even talk about Lyndon Johnson. And we still didn't know if we were going to war. We still didn't know if the country was under attack. We just didn't know what was happening, and it was awful. To tell you the truth, 25 years later, I still don't know what to think. I have no idea. No idea why it happened. No idea who was behind it. No idea as to whether or not any of the conspiracy talk holds any water at all. I still don't know what to think 25 years later.
This is Charlie Davis in the 970 WFLA News Center.
A free hot dog stand with each used car purchase. Hold on a minute.
The room was, it's a corner room. It was on the second floor. There were 2 windows that overlooked the Cooper Hospital and 1 window that overlooked a parking lot. It had a double bed, a matching bureau, a matching chest of drawers, a wooden chair with wooden arms, wooden legs, but big cushions for the seat in the back, and a straight-back chair. I had the television on the straight-back chair. I had gone out that morning and bought some donuts. And I'd come back. I was laying there across the bed eating the donuts, watching the funeral. And suddenly they cut away to the basement in Dallas. And damn it, there was that little guy that had shot the president, and somebody was shooting him. Right there on my television, right there in my house. I would eventually move out of that rented room. I would live in a lot of places. Some almost as bad, some much better, thank you. I would come to find out more about that group that I read about in Earl Wilson's column from England. I would come to find out more about girls and life in general, and there would be a procession of cars, and there would be more drugs and more places to see and people to get to know and things to do and experience and possess. There would be any number of unforgettable days in my life. It was the first day I worked on a radio station. I will never forget it as long as I live. It came several years later, 7 years later, in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. It was a memorable day. There was the day when men walked on the moon, where for hour upon hour upon hour again I sat glued to a television set. My nerve ends tingling, my flesh wet with sweat and anticipation and excitement and fear, waiting for a couple of human beings to set foot safely on the moon. There were wedding days. I remember them both. There was the day that my mother died. A very, very strange day. A day that started out pretty much like any other. A day where I was shooting a television commercial and got a call right in the middle of the commercial that my mother was about to die. And looked around at all the people who had worked all afternoon for the miserable television commercial that now depended upon me and didn't know what to do. There was the call that came many hours later that she had actually died. Oh, I'll never forget that. Suddenly a thunderstorm arose. The clocks started ringing off the hours, and the shutters were blown open by the breeze as the phone rang with a call that my mother had finally passed on. It was a day I shall never forget. But somehow none of these days really ever approached the emptiness of November 22nd, 1963, the uncertainty, even the fear. I shall never forget that day as long as I live. Nor will I ever understand it. I know that it changed my life, but I don't know how. I don't know what would have been had the events of November 22nd, 1963 never taken place. I don't know what would have happened, but I know that it's not the same. I don't know if it's better, I don't know if it's worse, but I know that it's not the same. That angers me. It's not fair that somebody played with my life and with your life and maybe with the entire world. Nobody's supposed to have that kind of power. Nobody's supposed to be able to have that much of an effect. No, I didn't like John Kennedy. I didn't support him in 1960, and I didn't like him in 1963. I thought most everything he got involved in was stupid. I really disagreed with many of his policies. About the only things that I really liked were the way he talked down the steel barons and made them roll back their prices. That seemed kind of neat. And I liked the way that he dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although at the time I did not understand, I did not realize that we had the Soviet Union ringed with missiles a hell of a lot closer than 90 miles, thank you. And I assumed that they were putting the missiles there because they wanted to go to war, and that they really were planning on taking out Chicago and Philadelphia and Miami and Atlanta. But that's beside the point. That's all in retrospect. I liked the way he did that. I liked the way he stood up to them damned Russians, made them take their missiles and made them go home. But that's about the only thing I liked. But damn it, you don't go shooting people because you don't agree with them or you don't like some of the things that they're doing. These were disagreements. These were differences of opinion. And I couldn't understand this little wimpy guy bringing his rifle to work and hiding behind the boxes and shooting John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I mean, I would have much preferred Richard Nixon. There are no two ways about that. But even by 1963, I was beginning to concede that, well, at least the Kennedys were interesting. They were good press, and my mother liked them. Made her happy, kept her off my back. So maybe they weren't all bad. So I would ask you for the remainder of this afternoon, where were you in November of 1963? I'm not talking about a physical location. Talking about where were you? And do you think the world changed? How do you think the world changed? I honestly don't know. I truly do not know. I don't know that anybody does, but what the hell, I'll listen to an opinion. I won't shoot you for it. Might shoot you down, but I won't shoot you. Let me give you the telephone numbers. In Pinellas County, 461-9352, 461-WFLA. In Hillsborough County, 990-9352, 990-WFLA. And, of course, there's even the practical joke line, 1-223-9797, 1-223-9797. There have probably been at least 25 years' worth of where were yous that dealt with I was in class, I was wherever. I don't know that I've ever really heard a where were you headwise in 1963. We tend to remember things a lot differently than they really were. Sometimes the picture gets a little rosier. Sometimes you tend to forget things that were really very important. But there were kids doing drugs in 1963, and there were anti-war protesters, and there were all kinds of things going on, many of which are still very major problems today. I don't know that the world would have been any better had John Fitzgerald Kennedy not been assassinated. I don't really know how it changed because he was. I just know that it did change. I don't know that we lost our innocence on that day. I know that we lost a president. And I know that we did have to finally come to the grips with the horrible fact that indeed sometimes, even in America, awful things could happen. As you well know, a lot of awful things happened in a great deal of rapid succession from that point on, or at least so it seems. I don't know that one had anything to do with the other. I just know that it's a fact that awful things happened. And that nobody seems to remember those awful things happening before November 22nd, 1963. (461-9352) In Pinellas, 461 WFLA. In Hillsborough, 990-9352, 990 WFLA. Where were you? Where were you really?
While you're dreaming, I'm out of bed at 2:30 every morning preparing material for our morning show, but I wouldn't trade my job for anything in the world. I'm Al Gardner, squad leader on Gardner & Company weekday mornings. Won't you join me?
News Radio 970 WFLA, Tampa Bay.
Good afternoon.
WFLA.
Unreal. 6.5 minutes after the hour of 1 o'clock. I'll give out the phone numbers again. Excuse me, 990-9352 in Hillsborough, 461-9352 in Pinellas. I know I asked it a little bit differently, and, there are probably 17,000 people out there that want to tell us the exciting details of precisely where they were. Hey, that's fine and well. You've been doing it for 24 years. I, of course, asked, a little bit more esoteric question. Where were you really? You know what I mean? And, how did the world change? Hey, that's too much for you guys. Don't sweat it. I'll sit here and listen for 2 hours to boring details as to, I was at a gas station. Jack in Pinellas Park. Jack, you're on the air at 970 WFLA.
Hello, Bob. How you doing?
Fine, Jack.
Well, mentally, I was kind of feeling sorry for myself when this happened. I was in a bunch of mud, and doing things generally that the Army does when you're in there, when this came down. And like I said, I really didn't have any thoughts on Kennedy or any of the political theme. But after all this happened, and I had time to think about it, I think nobody should have to die that way, especially just because he's a politician or people disagree with his views.
How old were you?
I was 19 at the time, and I was first time away from home, and I really didn't think much of politics or anything. All I was thinking about was trying to get some kind of way to get home for Christmas at that time.
What were you doing in the Army? Were you drafted?
Pardon?
What were you doing in the Army? Were you drafted?
No, I volunteered, but I was infantry, and of course, being in Germany, like I said, we were on FTX at the time, and I think everybody there was feeling kind of sorry and down for themselves. But when we got the word and we were put on full alert, I think that there were a lot of people there, including myself, who thought about other things, reflected about what happened, and that we were really kind of lucky to be alive. And
were you scared?
That's the main thing I thought about.
Were you scared?
Yes, I was. Anybody who, because we really thought we were going to war at the time, because we were, like I said, we were on FTX. We had blank ammo and all this kind of stuff, and they put us back to the regroup area, put us on full alert. We were infantry, and issued live rounds, even the mortar, and they even brought in airborne artillery for us. So we thought we were going to war.
How long did that last?
We were on full alert for 48 hours. Finally, we stood down on the second day.
Did you get home for Christmas, by the way?
No, I didn't. And to be honest with you, that was the least of my worries. Because I didn't agree with Mr. Kennedy's politics and some things now that I get older and I understand a little bit more what was going on. But basically, he was a good man. And I don't think that anyone or anything or any reason justifies the way he died. And I think he was a good man anyway.
Jack, I thank you very much.
Have a good day.
You too. 10 minutes after the hour of 1 o'clock, 990-9352 in Hillsborough, 461-9352 in Pinellas. Al in Sarasota. Al, you're on the air at 970 WFLA.
Bob, how you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
I'd like to commend you on an excellent memory listening to the radio. I really can't imagine how somebody can remember all those details, but you did, and you stirred up some of my memories. Where I was at that time, without giving a physical location, I was 14, and as any teenager is, you're very emotional about everything that comes along in your life, whether it be love, death, or anything that happens to you. And when the news came, I was more or less in a deep state of shock, and I got very, very depressed. And I kind of lost my innocence then, not sexually, of course, but I lost my emotional innocence, and I was really... I really believed at that time, and looking back.
What do you mean by that? What? Because I'm always hearing that term. That was the day that America lost its innocence. What exactly? Excuse me. Do you mean by that?
That I think we all realize as Americans that no institution or person was invulnerable, and I think looking back on that, the violence we've had in our society since then, that after that one day, at that time of my life, it was just an extreme shock as it was for other people. I just realized that no person, government, or institution or individual is above being harmed by someone with just a little, slight bent or whatever. And, that it may sound kind of crazy, but it's not a definition of loss of innocence. I'm just saying from my interpretation of it, from what I observed. And, I'd read in history books when I was in class about, Lincoln getting shot and other presidents being assassinated. It didn't hit home. It really didn't. It was like in a book and far away. You never realized it. But then when it happened to John Kennedy, boy, it really hit home. And I realized that, with all the protection that was afforded him, somebody who really had a problem got to him for whatever reason. And I think Ford and Reagan have realized that even with the protection they had, somebody, could still get to them.
How do you think the world might have been different the last 25 years had that not happened?
I
you ever
agree.
think about that?
Yes, and I think we have become more numb to the fact of there's violence in the world. Someone goes and shoots up a McDonald's in California, and someone comes into a classroom and kills people. It's like, well, okay, so what
That used to
else
happen.
new?
That used to happen.
Yeah.
It really did.
Well, I didn't seem to with such frequency. Do you think? I don't think so.
With such frequency, I'm not sure it was reported with such frequency.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was reported with such graphic detail.
Yes.
But I remember vividly, again, back in the summer of 1963, I actually knew two people who ended up murdering, for no reason under the sun, a human being and stealing a few dollars from him. That was not unheard of by any stretch of the imagination.
And your comment about how everything was brought to us live in our homes, I think, with the development of media and instant communications, perhaps you're right. Perhaps things haven't really accelerated, but they've been brought right to us immediately, live on the spot. I
don't ever recall anybody being shot in my living room before.
Well, you've noticed that. But, I really, since then, that was a change in my life about my attitude towards society and things like that. One interesting point that you brought up about the image of Johnson in the airplane taking the oath. I watched a program yesterday on Kennedy. I can't remember which one. There's been so many in the last few days, but it was pointed out that I guess under the Constitution, if a president is assassinated, the vice president automatically assumes the presidency, and he doesn't need to be sworn in. But it was their understanding that Lyndon Johnson was a stickler for protocol, and he wanted to demonstrate to the people that somebody was going to take charge, that the world would go on, and the United States was in a presidency.
Well, it was also very important for the world to see the picture of Mrs. Kennedy standing next to him to relieve some of those immediate rumors.
Yeah.
That Johnson was somehow involved in this assassination plot.
Yes, you're right. But it was just a very interesting point that I had not realized, and even though I learned it in school, I just had forgotten about it. But very interesting. Bob, thanks for your time, and enjoy your day. I appreciated your time.
Thanks for yours. Be good. 990-9352 in Hillsborough. 461-9352 in Pinellas. Jack in St. Petersburg. Jack, you're on the air.
Hi there, Bob.
Hi, Jack. Doing fine?
Good. I guess I was kind of out of the mainstream in 1963 in this country, kind of like I am today. It started for me a long time, though, before Jack Kennedy was shot. I remember I lived in that part of the country. I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, and I remember when I was a little kid, we'd go to like a department store, and I would notice, I was holding my mother's hand and walking to the elevator, and I'd notice that there were two water fountains. There was literally a porcelain white water fountain and a porcelain black water fountain. And I asked her why, and she said that it was because the black one was for colored people to drink out of, as she referred to them, and that the white one was for white people to drink out of. And I didn't think that was right. And I was a little bitty kid, but I wanted to make some kind of statement about it, so I drank out of the black water fountain. And from that time on, I have found myself always kind of in the forefront of making statements against the things that I see that are wrong with this company, or with this country. And along in the early 60s, about the time that Kennedy was shot, I was just as much out of the mainstream. I was down in South Texas in what they call the lettuce strikes with migrant farm workers and that sort of thing.
But that was the main difference between then and now. I think there's a lot wrong today. There was a lot wrong then, but there were just more people for some strange reason back in the early 1960s who were willing to say, hey, there's something wrong here. There are things that need attention, things that need addressing.
That's very true. And And at that point in time, I really thought that I was making a profound difference because I was in the Let Us Strikes, and I was in anti-war protests.
And you did make a profound difference.
But I'm not at all sure that I did, because the one thing that I'm struck by about the fact that someone like Kennedy was the fact of his being assassinated, in fact, brought Johnson into power. And having known Johnson's politics in Texas like I did, I knew him to be, while he was an old backroom politician in the ultimate extreme, the smoke-filled room kind of a politician, and the wheeler and dealer type politician, he had a certain amount of caring for minorities and things of that nature.
Well, it was something that both he and Richard Nixon had that John Kennedy didn't have, and that was a civil rights record in the Senate.
That's exactly right. And he perpetuated the civil rights reforms that were brought about in this country and unfortunately have recently been decimated by the current administration. And back then, as I say, as far out of the mainstream as I seemed to be from the standpoint of the numbers of people who held my views versus the number of people who didn't seem to hold a view, or at least if they held it.
Jack, let's wrap it up here because I got to move along.
Okay. My simple point is that then, as now, I was simply out of the mainstream. Today, we are in a situation where all the things that we strove for in the 60s and the early 70s are being systematically wiped out, whether it's
Jack, at that point,
or anything else.
Jack, at that point, I got to break in. I thank you very much. Charlie Davis standing by with a weather update. Charlie.
Forecasters at the National Hurricane Center in Coral Gables tell us the wind.
A training ground for the future.
1:33 the time. Red in Sulphur Springs. Hi, Red. You're on the air, 970 WFLA.
What a time that was, Bob, back in the 60s. I grew up here in Tampa, and we really had some heroes back then when John Kennedy was president with our space program and the astronauts. And when we were in school back in the early 60s, they let our classrooms go outside, and we could see John Glenn go into space, and we could see Alan Shepard go into space here in Tampa. We could look across the state, and we could see the orange.
I didn't realize those rockets were big enough.
They were even back then. In fact, we could see several of them fail whenever they would launch some of these other missiles that weren't manned, and they would have to blow them up when they'd have some sort of failure, and they'd have to destroy them on the way up in orbit. And this was an extremely dynamic time back in the early 60s for us.
Red, I understand what you're saying, but let's look at this. Let's really be cold and calculating. A lot of those heroes didn't deserve to be heroes.
That's true. But
Should we still have them anyway?
Oh, absolutely. We had to have some sort of person to look up to that had a positive a goal and a positive value.
I basically agree with you, but I can think of one or two guys now who are quasi-heroes whose personal lives simply do not warrant it. I can think of, for example, a certain baseball player who kept a mistress for 3 or 4 years and comes home to town and, lends his name to a very worthy charity, and people just kind of forget that fact that this family man, this pillar of the community, lied to his wife and lied to everybody in the entire world with keeping a mistress.
I think Babe Ruth was another one of those kind.
Well, yeah, probably was, but what do you do? What's more important?
I think overall it was the positive values that people were interested in, and here in the South at that time it was a period of turmoil where I had old members of the family that were the old-fashioned Dixiecrat type of people that had the Confederate flag on the wall, and even had this one old uncle that had a printed up sign that was circulated around amongst his buddies that said Khrushchev, Kennedy, Castro, and King not welcome here. And I remember that just like it was, burned into my head. That was the tone amongst that generation.
The 3 Ks, huh?
Absolutely. And you talk about that little TV set that you used to watch. I still have this little 9-inch General Electric portable TV that all that stuff came over on. Doesn't work anymore, Bob, but every time I look at that TV, it sure brings back a lot of memories as to the things
I'm kind of fascinated with this, with the prospect of the heroes that you bring up, and I'm sitting here wondering if maybe it was because we let guys get away with, and sometimes gals, that would let guys get away with less than respectable behavior and still permitted them to become heroes. We hid their indiscretions. I wonder if that is what has really led more to the downfall of heroes.
Maybe
led to the downfall of society. If the good guys can get away with this, why can't the normal guys?
Maybe I was just a naive teenager at the time, Bob, but, you know, people recalled Marilyn Monroe singing for John Kennedy on his birthday, and when I was 13, I never had any understanding of the affairs going on supposedly between the Kennedy brothers and these other women, and that just didn't enter into our consciousness. But I sure remember the 60 election. My classmates and I, it was a religious thing. They didn't want to vote for Kennedy because he was a Catholic, of all things. And down here in the South, that just wasn't a good thing, where you had these Baptists running everything. And I had friends that were Catholics, and we talked about it all the time out there in the street whenever we were goofing off after school. And to us, that was the issues of the time. And you know, when those days passed, it just seemed like we were still hung up in the 60s. We were still craving that dynamic force that was generated at the time, and it just seemed like the country just hasn't been the same since then.
Do you think it's more a case of the turbulence of the 60s was triggered by John Kennedy's assassination, or was this turbulence already built in and John Kennedy was just the first casualty?
He was just swept along with the tide, I believe.
So in other words, we didn't lose our innocence on November 23rd or November 22nd, 1963. It actually happened sometime prior to that?
Yeah, it was in the pipeline at the time, and I'm afraid he was just, you know, part of the debris that was swept along with it.
How long do you think it had been in that pipeline?
Since the mid-50s that I could see. I sure remember...
I think you're right.
I remember people being thrown out of the Palace Theater downtown because they wanted to sit in the white section, and these people were black.
I think you're right.
And that's what changed America. And I just don't have any more to say, Bob. I'm enjoying your program, and I'll sit back and listen to some of these others.
Thank you very much, Red.
Okay, bye.
Two lines available, both in Hillsborough, 990-9352, 990-WFLA. Ron in St. Petersburg. Ron, you're on the air at 970 WFLA.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I was 13 at the time, and it really baffled me and confused me because, you know, I guess I picked up the vibrations from all the adults, okay, and it kind of astounded me. You know, as a kid, you realize nothing like this happens. You don't think nothing like this happens, but the leader of our country got killed and all that. My real question is, though, what do you think? Apparently Oswald didn't do it from all the reading I've been doing and all the talk shows I listen to. And
no, I disagree. Oswald, from most of the people who have done serious work, was involved to one degree or another for sure.
Yeah, but I listened to I don't know whose show it was yesterday. Okay, it may have been today, Liz Richards or whatever. Okay, about the book this guy's supposed to be writing. Oh, that was this morning on the what's the name show.
Alan Gardner and Company.
Yeah, okay, and it was very informative and really left a big question in my mind. And even he didn't think, and the callers that called in and the guys that wrote the books and everything, they don't think that Oswald did it. They thought it was done through mafia or whatever. Do you think, if that's the case, 25 years later or whenever, there's no statute of limitation on murder, naturally, do you think the real ones that did it will ever be brought to justice?
No.
So
no.
They just get away with murder?
No, I do not like conspiracy theories. I do not have a conspiracy theory per se in this particular case, but I have every reason to suspect, without naming names because I don't know who those names are, but I have every reason to suspect that this was not a Lee Harvey Oswald acting as an individual situation. I also have every reason to suspect that Oswald was somehow involved with it. Whether or not he knew he was involved with it is open to question. But my speculation, if he put a gun to my head and said, hey, okay, Lassiter, take a wild guess here, I would think it could be traced back to either the CIA or the FBI, possibly both. Possibly some form of Army intelligence. I don't know for sure, but some form of intelligence within the federal government, and that is the reason that the records have been sealed, because it would just be too much of a shock for America to handle.
But don't you realize the shock that's taking place now by the people? 25 years later, they're reading into it more and more, and I don't think the people are that dumb. They realize, you know, it's almost been proven that Oswald did not fire the shots that killed him.
Well, Ron, keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, there are close to 250 million people in this country.
Granted.
Only a handful of them really ever think about it. So there are only a handful of people, such as yourself, who sit down, give serious consideration to it, who maybe even go out and buy the books and read them, and maybe even sit there and make your own notes and try to come up with your own scenarios as to what could have happened. However, if this information does exist, and if it were brought out and laid on the table, then you'd have 250 million people aware of it. You would have 250 million people who no longer had any faith, hope, trust, confidence whatsoever in their government. You think we don't get anybody to show up to vote now? Wait and see what would happen in the next election after that.
Yeah, I can imagine. You know, it's, I don't know, just like day in and day out, you talk to people, you hear people say this about this guy, this about this one, and this. I personally think it would have been the finest presidents we ever had.
And then there's another horrible possibility, Ron. Then a great debate in the nation would begin. And there would be, believe it or not, literally a group of people who would sit back and say, well, you know, I don't like this, but all things considered, I think the people that assassinated the president had the best interest of the nation in mind. And they would justify that assassination. And what that would in essence end up doing is make it so much easier for the next time a group of lunatics decided that the best way to deal with a president that you didn't like his opinions and ideas was to blow him away.
So then if the real truth came out, it would just blow the American people away. They wouldn't know how to handle it, apparently.
I think so, even though I'd like to know the real truth.
Yeah, just like I stated, you know, that you hear every day someone bitching about this one or doing this or I didn't do, and you ask 90% of the people that you talk to about the presidency and the elections, you ask them, do you vote? And well, no. Well, then I tell them, shut the hell up. You know, at least I went out there and voted, okay? And my wife, okay, we voted, and everybody I know, my friends and stuff voted. But it's just disgusting, and I'm still in a state of shock to realize we're letting this happen in the great US of A. This don't happen in other countries, or it's supposed to happen in other countries, not to us. You know, and it makes me wonder and worry, was my little old vote worth it? Okay, was my wife's vote worth it? Or whoever voted? You know, because I don't know. It's sickening.
Well, I know there is one thing that we delude ourselves into believing, and that is that participation used to be much, much better, even just a few years ago. And one of the things that we found out in this current election is that voter turnout could be compared with voter turnout back in the 1920s. It's been that bad for a half a century at least, and maybe even longer than that.
Oh, well. All I can say is I've got to hang in there and do the best I can as an individual, okay, and try to persuade people to do what I think is right. But I don't know. It's hard to believe this is the United States of America. Hey, I want to thank you for listening to me as long as I did, huh?
My pleasure.
All right, be good.
You too.
Bye.
990-9352 in Hillsborough, 990-WFLA. Pinellas, one line open, 461-9352, 461-WFLA. No real rhyme or reason. Obviously, the 25th anniversary of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I was hoping, and so far so good, that we might be able to avoid the usual, while I was sitting in class, while I was, typing up a letter for Mr. Jones, that these things are important, but it's even more important to know where the hell you were really at on that November day 25 years ago, if you know what I mean by where you were really at. Charlie Davis standing by with the WFLA weather brief. Charlie.
Well, the soggy weather continues.
News Radio 970 WFLA.
Bob in Tampa. Bob, you're on the air at 970 WFLA.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
Fine.
Hey, got a question.
Sure.
Who really gives a damn?
Who really gives a damn about what?
About John Kennedy. I don't know where I was at 2 years old. I was 2 years old when this all happened.
Mm-hmm.
But growing up, I heard about how great of a president he was and everything, and it all ended up, from what I could see, is he botched the Bay of Pigs. He had no human rights campaign going. The only thing he had going for him, he was pretty and he got on TV, one of the first presidents that got on the television.
Mm-hmm.
So, who really cares?
Well, I think you ought to care.
Well,
I think you ought to care a great deal because, you see, back then, in the 1960s, you're, obviously an 80s kind of guy, but back then in the 1960s, people didn't routinely take shots at presidents as they now do. Ronald Reagan has had shots fired at him. Jerry Ford has had shots. Who in God's name would want to hurt Jerry Ford? I mean, come on. Has had shots fired at him. It was a different world, my friend.
Well,
and I would think it would behoove you to try to figure out how you might get back to some of those things, like
I understand
not
that.
taking shots at presidents.
I understand that all, but if you really looked at his record, you know, the only thing he had really going for him was his charisma.
I don't believe we're talking about John Kennedy's record so much as we're talking about the fact that a president of the United States was assassinated.
Right.
There has been no president, including, Ronald Reagan, who I couldn't disagree with more, who has deserved to be shot.
Well, I tell you
Hoover
what,
didn't
if I was
deserve
one
to
of the
be
guys
shot.
on the beachhead of the Bay of Pigs, I might take a pop shot at him.
Oh, really?
Sure.
Interesting.
Being in the position
Well, wait a
they
second.
were...
I was under the impression that the guys on the beachhead at the Bay of Pigs were freedom fighters. These were people who... Are you telling me that you would like to join freedom fighters fighting for democracy and then have me believe that you would also assassinate the duly elected head of a democracy?
No, I didn't say that.
Yes, you
I
did.
would like to take a pop shot. That didn't mean I would do it.
Because democracy doesn't mean a damn thing to you.
What I'm saying is the animosity, I'm sure those people sitting on the beachhead in Cuba...
I don't give a damn about those spicks. If they're the people that did it, I'll run every damn one of them out of the country.
So none of us Americans were on that beachhead. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you.
That's not true.
Yes, it is true.
I know people that's been on that beachhead.
Yeah, right.
And they weren't
Cubans.
spicks, whatever you want to call them.
Cubans. If they shot my president, they're spicks.
Hey, if
they messed up my country for a couple of decades, they're spicks.
If I'm invited...
And a lot of them are still alive.
If I'm asked to go into a beachhead to fight for democracy...
Nobody asked them to go into a beachhead. They asked themselves. And they were dead wrong.
I'm sure they would hate Kennedy with a passion.
Well, then I think it would behoove you to go back and withdraw your initial statement about who cares.
I still...
It ought to be cared about an awful lot, because I would think that we would want to disassociate ourselves totally and completely with any similar group of lunatics who might come back and disrupt our democracy.
The point I was trying to make when I said who cares, it's a big deal, but crying in the streets and all of this, hey, there's a point.
Well, there's another problem that you 80 guys seem to have, and that is that you just do not understand the value of studying and being familiar with history, my young friend. Because if you want to know what's new, then study what's old.
Well, who put us in the Vietnam era?
If you want to know the future, study the past. Who put us in the Vietnam era?
Sir.
Harry Truman.
Harry Truman.
That's right.
You don't think Kennedy had any advisors over there?
Yeah, I know he had a lot of advisors over there.
Hey, if you go in to fight a war, you go and fight a war.
I beg your pardon. You see, I didn't even whet your curiosity with that, did I?
No, sir.
Because you don't give a damn about history, my friend. You see, if you knew anything about history, you would know that in 1949, if memory serves me, it might have been 1950, but 49 or 50, Ho Chi Minh went to Harry Truman and said, please, help us get our country back. For hundreds of years, we have been jerked around by foreigners. Now it happens to be the French. We want a democracy. We want to unify our nation and have a democracy here. Harry Truman said, go to hell, because the French are our buddies. They helped us out, so we're going to help them continue to have their colonial empire. We're going to let the French rob you of your democracy, rob you of your wealth in your nation, enslave you and keep you under the boot, and don't bother me again. Well, Ho Chi Minh took his argument a little bit further up the road to somebody else who said, we think that's terrible. And by the way, it was Dwight David Eisenhower who sent over the first military advisors. John Kennedy sent them over in droves. Lyndon Johnson sent over troops in droves. But that's exactly what happened, my young friend.
Well, they call me Tampa Bay's biggest athletic supporter, and it's absolutely true. Ted Webb inviting you to join me for the Sports Huddle, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
News Radio 970 WFLA, Tampa Bay.
Our next tropical storm update at 2:15, bulletins at once. I'm Charlie Davis.
Bob Lassiter, News Radio 970 WFLA.
Fred in Anna Maria. Hi, Fred. You're on the air at 970 WFLA.
Hey, Bob.
Yep.
How are you?
Fine.
Good. It's a first-time caller, and I was a little bit disturbed at the young people, the way they feel, and their reaction to this whole thing about John Kennedy's death. It's surprising how the young people feel these days.
Well, I dare say that a generation ahead of you might be a little bit appalled at your lack of concern for things like perhaps Pearl Harbor Day or VE Day or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, they were their big days. The 80s kids haven't had their big day yet. I would hope that they never have one like that.
Right.
But apparently they need one.
I pulled out of a drawer, in fact, this week, a letter that I got, and if I could share it with you, it's a letter written by an intelligence officer the day that this all happened.
Sure.
He wrote a letter to us. He says, Fridays are normally a pleasant, happy days in our military base in Germany. Working the last day of the week, one is a little more industrious and efficient, for the weekend is just one sundown away. At 1700 hours at the Officers Club, free beer and pizza was served, and the beer right from its large German cask, the pizza hot and spicy. Friday, November 22nd, was to be a special day for us because it was the first opportunity for the wife to socialize a little since the birth of the baby. At 16:30 hours, the bugle sounded as it does every day at that time, and the flag was lowered from the high pole to the Star-Spangled Banner. It is always impressive to see the flag lowered on a military base. The traffic is halted, the soldiers and the men stand at rigid attention. No matter what the weather, the little children look in awe at the red, white, and blue. As usual at this time of day, the men in the office began to put their equipment, papers, and tools away. Maps were folded and hung in the vault as classified material was placed in its proper safe. The intelligence officer at Flugplatz Hahn was put to rest for the weekend. Are we going to work tomorrow, sir? Asked the sergeant. No, let's enjoy the weekend is the answer. We travel a few feet to the club, which is directly behind the intelligence building, taking a few deep breaths of fresh air, the few that a blue-collar worker can get. It was a busy week. We worked damn hard. That beer will taste good, and the wife will be here tonight. The beer was good. We took 3 or 4 deep draws. The long, arduous week was behind us. The wife entered and dressed in her new figure, and together we find our friends and settle down at a corner of the bar, drinking, eating, and conversing about the coming parties and soon-to-arrive holiday season. There's Major Housen, the weapons officer. We have to talk to him. Although it is a busy Friday, there's a little business we have to settle. One hates to be serious during a relaxing party, but beer in hand, we have to get this business settled, so we settle it. Then back to the group. Are you sure that the German nurse is a good babysitter? We asked the wife. Of course, she says. You don't have to have enough faith in people anymore. The minutes tick into a few hours, and we stroll back to the stage room where a band is arranging the paraphernalia.
I got to be honest with you. First of all, this doesn't sound like a letter. It sounds more like a magazine article.
No, it's not. It's a letter.
And secondly,
a good friend of ours.
Okay, well,
He's still an intelligent officer today.
Okay, I'll take your word on that. But I've got to warn you, I've got like 3 minutes.
Okay. He has a few more drinks. He said, let's go over and cheer him up. This was the other officer. We go over to Sam and hear what he's saying to the officer next to him. The heart stops, the world stops, and I almost gag on my drink. What is he? No one knows. All that is confirmed is that the president has been shot in Dallas. We have to sit down. My God damn this world. And now a captain is handing a Negro with the saxophone a note. The dark man is trembling. We close our eyes. With a low, quivering voice, the band leader says, "Oh no," and states, "Ladies and gentlemen, the president has been shot and killed in Dallas."
That's an interesting phrase right there. Back in '63, we still had Negroes.
Yeah. Antagonizing, and that's in the service too. Antagonizing agony, he says. Why now? My God, I can't move. No one moved. No one could. One doesn't know what to do. You bite your lips. Still no one moves. Then everyone begins to leave the room, the club, the base. As we head home, your head pounds in disbelief. There is a wheel in your brain that can't stop turning. Why John Fitzgerald Kennedy? You don't believe it. You don't believe it. But done is done, and you're angry. So angry, tears come to your eyes, and gradually they turn to tears of sorrow for the president, for his family, and for us.
You know, I never really stopped to think about the people who were outside of the country. It must have been even worse for them.
Yeah.
Out of touch. Not really knowing for sure what was going on.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. He said at 16:30 hours, 3 days later, the bugle once again plays at the base. It is heard from inside the church, and over the organ one can hear the Star-Spangled Banner. Goodbye, John Kennedy. Goodbye to our military commander-in-chief, the country's president, the world's inspiration. I choke in my disbelief, but I have to say goodbye. Signed, Bill.
Hell of a
He's still
writer.
an intelligent officer, and
He's a hell of a letter writer. I'm glad I'm not his pen pal. I couldn't write letters like that.
no, I couldn't either.
But Fred, I thank you very, very much for sharing it with us.
Okay.
Take care, my friend.
Bye-bye.
One line available. It's in Hillsborough County. Charlie Davis standing by with a WFLA weather brief.
Charlie Davis in the 970 WFLA newsroom.